I was standing at my kitchen sink, washing the breakfast dishes, when something made me stop. I don't know what it was. Call it instinct. Call it 63 years of being a mother and learning to listen to the quiet feeling that creeps up your spine when something isn't right. My son-in-law, Patrick, had called me the night before to check in, which he never did. Not because he was rude, but because he was the kind of man who assumed everything was fine unless he heard otherwise. So when his name appeared on my phone at 8:15 on a Tuesday evening, I answered on the first ring. He said everything was okay. He said my daughter was just tired. He said she'd been working long hours and hadn't been sleeping well and that I shouldn't worry. I told him I wasn't worried, but I was. My daughter, Vanessa, was 34 years old, a pediatric nurse at Mercy Regional Medical Center in Columbus, and the kind of woman who texted me good morning almost every single day without fail. It was our thing. I'd send her a little weather update from my end. I live in a small town called Millbrook, about 2 hours north of Columbus, and she'd send back a coffee cup emoji and whatever was making her laugh that morning. A funny patient story. A meme her co-worker sent her, something small. Something that meant she was okay. I hadn't gotten a good morning text in 4 days. The night before Patrick called, I'd texted her twice. Nothing alarming, just thinking of you, sweetheart, and then, the next morning, a picture of the cardinal that kept landing on my back fence, which she always loved. She used to say cardinals were good luck. I never got a response. Patrick's phone call, with his too careful voice and his too smooth explanation, didn't make me feel better. It made me feel worse. I dried my hands on the dish towel, looked out at the backyard where the cardinal was sitting on that fence post like it was waiting for something, and made a decision. I was going to Columbus. I didn't call ahead. I know how that sounds, like I'm one of those mothers who doesn't respect boundaries, who shows up uninvited and makes everything about herself. I've spent 30 years trying not to be that woman, but something in my chest was pulling me south down Route 23, and I have learned, the hard way, more than once, that when your body is telling you something that clearly, you don't argue with it. I packed an overnight bag. I filled my thermos with coffee. I left a note for my neighbor Dolores. She waters my plants when I'm away, and I got in my car and drove. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and the trees along the highway were that particular shade of orange and red that always made me think of Vanessa as a little girl, jumping into leaf piles in our backyard in Millbrook. She used to drag me outside every single afternoon after school to watch her. My husband, God rest him, would film it on the old camcorder. We still have those tapes somewhere. I thought about that the whole drive down, which tells you something about the state I was in. When your mind goes looking for the safest, most beloved memories you have of a person, it usually means you're afraid. I pulled into their neighborhood just after 11 in the morning. Their house was a tan-colored colonial on a cul-de-sac in the Grandview Heights area. Vanessa had planted yellow mums along the front walk last fall, and they were still there, though they'd gone brown now. The curtains in the front window were drawn. Patrick's truck was in the driveway, which surprised me. He worked in commercial real estate and rarely worked from home. His hours were even more unpredictable than Vanessa's. I sat in my car for a moment. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that what came next wasn't something I walked into carelessly. I knew I was about to change something. I just didn't know how much. I knocked on the front door. Nothing. I knocked again louder and called out, "Patrick, it's me. It's Mom." I heard movement inside slow. Then the door opened. What I saw stopped my breath. Patrick was standing there in a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants, 3 or 4 days of stubble on his face, eyes that looked like he hadn't slept since the last time I'd spoken to him. But it wasn't his appearance that knocked the air out of me. It was the way he looked at me, like a man who had been hoping and dreading this moment in equal measure, and now that it was here, he didn't know what to do with either feeling. "Where is she?" I said. I didn't even say hello. He stepped back from the doorway. "She's in the hospital," he said. "She's been there since Friday. 4 days. My daughter had been in the hospital for 4 days, and I didn't know." I walked past him into the house without a word. I set my overnight bag down in the entryway, and I turned around and I looked at him and I said very quietly, "Tell me everything, right now." He sat down on the couch like his legs had given out, which maybe they had. He looked like a man who had been carrying something alone for too long, and was only just now remembering he didn't have to. Here is what he told me. Vanessa had collapsed at work on Friday morning. She'd been having chest pain for several days before that. She'd told Patrick, and he'd encouraged her to see a doctor, but she'd kept putting it off the way nurses sometimes do, the ones who spend all day treating other people and forget to look after themselves. On Friday, she was in the middle of a shift when the pain became unbearable, and a colleague caught her before she hit the floor. She was in the cardiac care unit at Mercy Regional, the very hospital where she worked. The irony of that was not lost on anyone. They had stabilized her. She had a condition called myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle, which they believed had been triggered by a viral infection she hadn't fully recovered from 2 months earlier. It was serious. It was treatable. But she was going to be there for at least another week, possibly longer, and she was exhausted and scared. And she had asked Patrick not to tell me because she didn't want me to worry. She didn't want me to worry. I sat with that for a moment. My daughter, lying in the cardiac care unit at 34 years old, and she'd told her husband to keep it from me because she didn't want me to worry. "Patrick," I said, "I understand why she asked you to do that. I do. But I need you to understand something." I kept my voice even. "I am her mother, and what I am feeling right now, sitting here having found out this way, is a great deal worse than anything I would have felt if you had called me on Friday." He put his face in his hands. "I know," he said. "I know. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have listened to her." I reached over and I put my hand on his arm because he looked like a man who was about to fall apart, and whatever else was happening, I needed him in one piece. "Take me to her," I said. We drove to the hospital together. She was on the 4th floor, in a private room at the end of the cardiac care wing. Patrick had gotten her a little stuffed bear from the gift shop, a silly thing, but she'd kept it on her bedside table. There was a whiteboard with her nurse's name on it. The monitors beeped softly. The curtains were open, and the October sky outside was a pale, washed-out grey. Vanessa was awake when we walked in. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. She looked small in that hospital bed, in a way that I hadn't seen since she was a child with a fever, and my chest did something complicated and painful that I think only other mothers will understand. Then she pressed her lips together and said, "Mom, I told him not to call you." "He didn't call me," I said. I drove myself. Something in her face shifted. Her chin trembled just for a second, and then she held out her hand, and I crossed the room and took it, and I sat on the edge of her bed, and I held her hand and didn't let go. She cried. Not the dramatic kind, just the quiet, tired kind that comes from holding it together for too many days in a row. I smoothed her hair back the way I used to when she was small, and I didn't tell her it was okay, because it wasn't quite okay yet, but I told her she wasn't alone anymore, and that was the truth. Patrick stood in the doorway. He looked like he wasn't sure if he should be in the room or not. I waved him in. We sat there, the 3 of us, for a while. Then I started asking questions, because that is what I do when I'm frightened. I gather information. I spoke to her doctor, a cardiologist named Dr. Osi, who was thorough and clear and didn't talk down to me when I asked follow-up questions. He explained the myocarditis again, explained the treatment protocol, explained what we were watching for and what would trigger escalation. He said she was responding well. He said the first 2 days had been the most critical, and they were past that now. He said with rest and monitoring and the right medications, most patients with her presentation made a full recovery. I wrote everything down in the small notebook I keep in my purse. Then I went home to their house and I cleaned it. I want to be clear. I am not a woman who cleans other people's houses to assert dominance or make them feel inadequate. I cleaned it because it needed cleaning and because I needed something to do with my hands. Patrick hadn't cooked a real meal since Friday. There were takeout containers on the counter and empty coffee cups lined up by the sink and a pile of unopened mail on the kitchen table that made me wince. He had been going back and forth to the hospital every day, and he'd been sleeping maybe 4 hours a night, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, the ordinary maintenance of life had simply fallen away. I made a grocery list. I drove to the Kroger 2 miles from their house. I came back and made a pot of soup, chicken and vegetable, nothing fancy but real food, the kind that fills your body up rather than just quieting your stomach. I made enough for 3 days. I put it in containers and labelled them. I started a load of laundry. While I was folding the laundry that evening, Patrick came to sit with me in the living room. He was quieter than usual. He and I had always gotten along well. He was a good man, I believed that genuinely. But there had always been a slight formality between us, the particular politeness of a son-in-law who wants to be respectful and a mother-in-law who doesn't want to overstep. That night, though, the formality was gone. He just sat there in the armchair across from me while I folded dish towels, and eventually he said, "Can I tell you something?" "Of course," I said. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I've been scared, since Friday. Every time I leave the hospital, I'm scared I'm going to get a call on the way home." He paused. "I haven't told Vanessa that because I didn't want to upset her, but it's been a really hard few days." I set down the dish towel I was holding, and I looked at him. He was 37 years old, my son-in-law, and in that moment he looked exactly like what he was, a man who loved his wife and was terrified of losing her and had been carrying it alone because he thought he was supposed to. "I know," I said. "I know it has, and I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." He looked at me. "You got here as soon as you knew," he said. "I should have known sooner," I said. He didn't argue with that. We sat in silence for a while, and it was the comfortable kind which told me something had shifted between us. When you sit in silence with someone and neither of you feels the need to fill it, it usually means you've moved past the formal part of knowing each other into something more like family. I stayed for the rest of the week. I went to the hospital every morning with Patrick. I sat with Vanessa while he went back to work. He'd taken the first week off, but his boss had been understanding, not indefinitely, and I told him to go, that I was there. I learned her nurses' names. I learned which of them she liked best, a young woman named Deja, who made her laugh, and which ones she found a little too cheerful at 6 in the morning. I brought her real coffee from the place on the corner because the hospital stuff tasted like regret, which was her description, not mine. I brought her a crossword book and her favourite cardigan from home and the small watercolour print from her office that she'd done herself in a class she took years ago, because she said looking at familiar things made the room feel less like a hospital room. She and I talked more in those 5 days than we had in years. There is something about a hospital room, the enforced stillness of it, the way time moves differently in there, that strips away the usual surface chatter. We didn't talk about schedules or logistics or who was bringing what to Thanksgiving. We talked about things that mattered, about my husband, her father, who died 6 years ago and whose absence we both still felt every day, about what she wanted her life to look like, about the promotion she'd been thinking about a charge nurse position, and whether she was ready for it, about the fact that she and Patrick had been talking about starting a family and had quietly stopped talking about it, and neither of them had addressed why. She told me she'd been more tired than usual for months, not the normal tired of shift work, but a bone-deep kind of tired that she'd been explaining away because she didn't have time to examine it too closely. "You know," I said, "I wish you'd called me when you were feeling that way." She looked at the ceiling. "I didn't want to worry you," she said. "Vanessa," I said, "worrying about you is something I am going to do regardless of whether you give me information or not. The only difference is whether I'm worrying with facts or without them. Facts are better, I promise you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a very you way to put it." "I've had 63 years to develop my rhetorical style," I said. She laughed, and it was the first time I'd seen her laugh since I arrived, and the sound of it was the best thing I'd heard in days. On the third day, I had a conversation that changed a few things. I had gone down to the hospital cafeteria to get a coffee and to give Patrick and Vanessa some time alone. I was sitting at a corner table, looking at my phone, when I overheard two women at the next table talking about insurance. One of them was loudly complaining about a denial letter she'd gotten from her husband's insurer regarding a procedure he'd had. She'd been on the phone with them for 3 hours and gotten nowhere. Something about it made me think. When I got back upstairs, I waited until Patrick stepped out for a moment, and then I asked Vanessa a question I'd been circling around for a couple of days. "What does your insurance situation look like?" I asked. "Are all the bills going through your work coverage?" She frowned slightly. "My work coverage should cover most of it," she said. "But there's also Patrick's plan. We're both on each other's plans as backup, which is what the benefits coordinator recommended when we got married. The coordination of benefits thing." She waved a hand vaguely. "Patrick handles most of that." "Okay," I said. "Why?" "I just want to make sure everything is in order," I said. When Patrick came back, I asked him, as casually as I could manage, whether he'd spoken to the insurance coordinator at the hospital yet. He had, he said briefly, but there had been some confusion about which plan was primary and which was secondary, and he hadn't had a chance to follow up because he'd been going back and forth between the hospital and work all week. "Let me do that," I said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," I said pleasantly. "I want to. I'm good at paperwork and you have enough on your plate." He gave me the folder where he kept their insurance documents. I stayed up that night at their kitchen table going through everything, their individual policies, the coordination of benefits forms, the itemized statements that had started coming in from Mercy Regional. I am not a financial expert, but I spent 30 years as an office manager for a medical practice in Millbrook, and I know how to read an insurance document. I know the difference between what should be covered and what someone is hoping you won't notice isn't. What I found wasn't fraud, but it wasn't nothing either. There was a billing code on one of the early statements that didn't match the procedure it was supposed to represent. A minor thing, maybe an error, but the kind of error that, if left uncorrected, could result in a claim denial that would cost them thousands of dollars. I also found that the coordination of benefits had been set up incorrectly. Patrick's plan had been listed as primary when Vanessa's work plan should have been primary given her employment status, which meant the claims that had already gone through were going to come back with coverage gaps. I made notes. I called the hospital billing department first thing the next morning and spoke to a woman named Beverly. I remember her name because she was competent and kind, which is not always the combination you get, and I explained what I'd found. She put me on hold for 12 minutes. When she came back, she confirmed both issues and said she would flag them for correction. Then I called the insurance coordinator for Patrick's employer plan and had a longer conversation about the COB setup. That took 45 minutes and required me to be firm twice and patient for the rest of it, but by the end, they had agreed to correct the primary-secondary designation and reprocess the claims that had already been submitted. I didn't tell Patrick or Vanessa what I was doing while I was doing it. I didn't want to alarm them or add to their stress load when there was still a question of whether the corrections would go through. I just quietly sat at their kitchen table every evening after dinner and worked through it. On the morning of the 6th day, Vanessa's doctor told her she was ready to go home. The discharge process took most of the day. It always does. But by 4 in the afternoon she was in the car, wrapped in her cardigan, with the little stuffed bear from the gift shop in her lap. She had a follow-up appointment in 2 weeks. She had a medication schedule and a list of symptoms to watch for. She had strict instructions to take 4 weeks of leave before returning to work, which her nurse manager had already approved. She also had me, following in my car, to help get her settled at home. That evening, after she was on the couch with a blanket, and Patrick was heating up the last of the soup I'd made, I sat down at the kitchen table with both of them and told them what I'd done with the insurance. I showed them my notes. I explained the billing code issue and what Beverly had done about it. I explained the COB correction and what it would mean for the claims going forward. Patrick pulled up his phone and looked at the insurance portal while I was talking, and I watched his expression shift from confused to focused to something that looked like relief. "The reprocessed claims," he said slowly. "If the COB correction goes through the way you're describing, it should reduce your out-of-pocket by somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000, I said, depending on how they process the earlier claims. He looked up from his phone and stared at me. $4,000 to $6,000, Vanessa said. Approximately, I said. I don't want to give you a number that turns out to be wrong, so consider that an estimate. But yes, the COB was set up incorrectly and it was going to cost you significantly. Vanessa was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Mom, how did you even know to look at that?" 30 years in a medical office, I said, and that woman at the cafeteria who was yelling about her denial letter, she was very loudly helpful. Vanessa laughed. Patrick looked at me for a long moment, in that way he had sometimes, assessing and a little overwhelmed, and then he said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to thank me," I said. "This is what I'm for." That night I slept in their guest room for the last time. I had already decided I was going home in the morning. Vanessa was home, she was stable, she had Patrick, and the best thing I could do was let them settle back into their life together without me underfoot. I know when to be present, and I know when to step back, and those are both things that took me a long time to learn. In the morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table while the neighborhood was still quiet, watching the early light come through the window. Vanessa came downstairs in her slippers, which surprised me. I'd expected her to sleep late. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me and didn't say anything for a while, and neither did I. It was that comfortable kind of silence again, the kind that means you don't have to perform for each other. Then she said, "I'm sorry I told him not to call you." "I know," I said. "I really did think I was protecting you." "I know that too," I said. "But Vanessa, I need you to hear something, and I need you to actually hear it, and not just nod and agree and then go back to doing what you've always done." I waited until she was looking at me. "I am your mother. My job is not to be protected. My job is to show up. That's all. That's the whole job. And I cannot do it if I don't know what's happening." She was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a bird started up. "Okay," she said finally. Not in the dismissive way. In the way that means someone has actually taken something in and is sitting with it. "Okay," I said. I drove home to Millbrook that morning. The trees along Route 23 had gone a little further toward bare in the past week, more brown than orange now, more skeleton than colour. The drive felt shorter than it had on the way down, which drives always do when you know what you're returning to, instead of what you're rushing toward. I got home just after noon. My neighbour had kept up with the plants. There was a casserole on my doorstep from the ladies at my church, which made me smile because I hadn't told anyone I'd been away, which meant the neighbourhood grapevine was still functioning exactly as it always had. I fed the casserole into the refrigerator and poured myself a cup of tea and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the back fence. The cardinal was there. I took a picture of it and sent it to Vanessa. 3 seconds later, a coffee cup emoji appeared on my screen. Then, I love you, Mom. I set my phone down on the counter and looked out at that little bird for a long time, and I thought about all the ordinary moments I had taken for granted and would never take for granted again. About the way Vanessa's laugh sounded when she was really laughing, not just being polite. About Patrick's face that first night in the living room when the formality fell away. About the cardiac care wing on the 4th floor of Mercy Regional, where a woman who'd spent her whole career taking care of other people had to learn, just for a little while, to let herself be taken care of. About what it means to show up. That's all any of us can do, in the end. Show up, pay attention, stay until you're not needed, and then go home and wait for the cardinal and answer on the first ring.